sunrise over a busy oil rig, a scene that's becoming increasingly familiar as the never-ending search for energy spreads out across the globe. This is a highly productive well in one of the world's major oil fields. It could be in one of a dozen places, one of the Arab Gulf states, for example, possibly Iran or North Africa. In fact, it's happening in Mexico. Make a list of the world's major oil producers, and Mexico would probably be the first name to spring to mind. And yet, over the last few years, Mexico has come from almost nowhere to one of the brightest prospects in the world oil scene. Mexico's had an oil industry since the beginning of the century. Back by the early 1920s, Mexico was second only to the United States as an oil producer. In 1938, Mexico became the first national Then on, Mexico Mexico export market was virtual. And production was kept low. Domestic needs. In the end, production dropped below demand. Mexico had started growing. It was a major leap to find new reserves. Brilliant paid off, with some spectacular strikes of oil and gas in the southern states of Tabasco, Chiapas, and Veracruz, and offshore in the Gulf of Campeche. But it wasn't until last year that the strikes were made public, and the world at large could see just how big a bonanza it was. The Mexicans see this new energy as a priceless national heritage, and they're determined to squeeze the maximum benefit out of every drop. That means not just getting out the crude, but processing both oil and gas to give them added value. Mexico is now spending millions of dollars on plants that can crack petroleum and sweeten natural gas to produce a variety of exportable byproducts. The plants are due for completion either next year or in 1980. Some of them will be the biggest of their kind in the world, and it looks as if they'll be needed. 2 years ago, Mexico's proven reserves of oil and natural gas were calculated at over 6 billion barrels. This figure soon doubled, and by the end of last year, it had become not 6, but 16 billion. According to the Mexicans, geological studies show that possible reserves are as high as 120 billion barrels of oil or its gas equivalent. If that's true, it would put Mexico up in second place behind the world's current oil giant, Saudi Arabia. Oil experts outside Mexico are still wondering just how much the latest estimates owe to optimism and national pride. But whatever the eventual figure, nobody is denying that Mexico has struck it rich. And it certainly couldn't have come at a more fortunate time, for the Mexican economy has been in deep trouble in recent years, culminating in a major devaluation of the peso last August. Until a few years ago, gas was the poorer nation. Now it's a highly valued fuel, worth at least as much, if not more, than oil. Mexico has plenty to spare for export. And since the most obvious customer was the United States, the power-hungry neighbor to the north, work began on building a pipeline. It looked like a certain dollar earner, but unfortunately the price didn't suit President Carter's energy policy, which is aimed at cutting down the fuel import bill. On top of that, Mexican nationalists were incensed at their heritage being sold off at any price. One angry critic called the pipeline a Panama Canal through the heart of Mexico. For the moment, the deal is off, but the pipeline is still going ahead, at least as far as northern Mexico, where it will become part of a national distribution network. Few people doubt, though, that it will eventually cross the Rio Grande.
No, lo que bajan de aquí para allá.
Some of the most exciting work is being done out in the Gulf of Campeche, where offshore platforms are probing the ocean floor to find out just how far the southern field extends. The target for this year is 15 exploratory wells, and there's little doubt that most of them will turn out to be productive. A dozen at a time. It takes between 60 and 70 men to crew each platform. This one's standing in 40 meters of water. It's been in operation since last December, looking for more wells to add to the 3 that have already been found and capped. On land, Mexico has got all the oil know-how it needs. At sea, it's different. But even so, the Mexicans have done their best to keep foreign participation to a minimum. American George Rugsdale, who works the drilling control gear, is one of only 3 Americans on this platform. National pride comes into it, but after 50 years of running its own oil industry, Mexico really doesn't need many lessons from outside. The new oil boom has brought jobs and money to the south. And nobody gets harder worked or better paid than the men on the rigs. They work 7 grueling 12-hour shifts in a row, followed by 7 days off at home. Those who live further away often extend that to a 14-day cycle. In return, they earn the equivalent of $700 or $800 a month, a huge amount by Mexican standards. On the rig, it's just bed and work, so if they want to spend any of their money, they have to wait until they get back on shore. Many of them come here to Villa Hermosa. Only a few years ago, it was just a small, quiet town on the banks of the river Mezcalapa. But all that changed since it became the center of the oil boom. In the last 7 years, the population has more than doubled, and there's been a similar rise in the cost of living. Property values have increased by 300%. Prices in the shops have rocketed. Even many of the everyday things are dearer here than anywhere else in the country. For the oil workers, prices like these aren't any real problem, and the local traders aren't complaining either. For the area's planners, this growth had to come anyway. All the oil money has done is make it come sooner and quicker. And they claim it's progress. The town's now got large, well-stocked supermarkets and a much wider range of services. Whether the inhabitants agree usually depends on whether they're getting their share of the oil bounty. Villa Hermosa has become a magnet for unemployed workers from all over the country. There's always a queue of hopefuls outside the job centre. Most of them have previous experience and skills which the local people don't have, so they tend to monopolise all the most highly paid jobs. The main employer is Pemex, the state oil company. The competition for jobs is so fierce that sometimes, it's alleged, workers actually... The road to sudden wealth is rarely easy. Mexicans are finding that an oil boom is no exception. This plant in Chiapas State, for example, there are jobs for 7,000 workers at the moment. But when the job's over, only 1,200 will be needed to actually run the plant. Few of them will be local. Construction workers like these belong to private firms under contract to Pemex. Most of them come from outside the state, working here during the week and returning to their families at the weekends. And when the job's over, they'll go home for good. So despite the enormous cost of the project, the benefit to the area in terms of jobs created is relatively small. The 1,200 workers who stay on here will be drawn from the ranks of these men. They're the most fortunate of all the oil workers because they're employed directly by Pemex. That means, firstly, that their jobs are permanent rather than seasonal. Secondly, and even more important, they're backed up by the labor union for the oil industry. That's a bonus well worth having. This is Pemex City, a company town southeast of Villa Hermosa. It's built around the gas processing plant, in the middle of the gas fields that are the first feeders of the pipeline going north. Apart from the normal processing plant, Pemex City also contains housing and other facilities which turn it into a virtually self-contained company town. The hotel, for example, caters for single workers and workers in transit. A room costs 90 pesos a month, no more than the cost of, for example, a chicken in the markets of Villa Hermosa. Married workers get company housing, and there's similar generosity here. The company builds the homes, then provides its workers with guaranteed loans to enable them to buy them. It even pays 9% of the interest, leaving the workers with barely 8% to pay themselves. Across the street, a school, built and run by the company, looks after the educational needs of workers' children. Both children and parents are completely covered for health care by a variety of company clinics. Here, a worker's child gets a course of tooth straightening from the company's orthodontist. Clinics at Pemex City handle between 300 and 400 cases a day, and only routine ones. For emergencies and serious cases, the company has fully equipped hospitals and regional centres. When fringe benefits like this are added to the high wages, it's easy to see why competition for a job with Pemex is so fierce. Most of the credit for the improvements in pay and conditions is claimed by the Oilmen's Union, a body whose power dates back 40 years. It was an official union strike for higher wages that actually led to the industry's nationalisation. But there are some people who believe that the union's hold on the industry is now too great. They claim it's led to overmanning and other inefficient practices. Still, they say the industry now riddled with corruption. The union exercising rigid controls over the lucrative outside contracts. Spreading the national wealth fairly has always been a problem in Mexico, despite its long-established revolution and its persistent attempts at measures like land reform. The money that's now beginning to flow from oil is a major challenge to the government's ability to turn slogans about equality into measures that will actually achieve it. These, for example, are the poor of Villahermosa, living in the shanty town known as Casablanca, ironically just 2 blocks behind the Pemex headquarters. They're not all grindingly poor, although to a football-crazy nation, a TV set tends to be as much of a necessity as a luxury. Most of them are people who simply haven't got the skills the oil industry needs. And so far, they've gained absolutely nothing from the frenzy of development going on around them. If anything, they've actually been made poorer because of the way oil money has pushed up prices in the shops. And they complain that even jobs outside the oil industry are now scarcer than they were before because of all the competition. None of this is news to Mexican officials, either in central government or in the southern states. Leandro Robarosa Wade is the governor of Tabasco State, and he's had personal experience of all the current difficulties.
Se ha presentado un fenómeno de desempleo que hemos experimentado, está correlacionado con los municipios petroleros. La industria es extractiva, decíamos hace unos minutos, y como tal no genera empleos. Por eso hemos estado pidiendo a Petróleos Mexicanos programas que permitan resolver este problema grave de desempleo. El petróleo es no renovable, un recurso no renovable. En este momento es abundante, en este momento está dando recursos económicos al país, nos está ayudando a salir de una situación económica difícil, pero queremos que aquí en la entidad en donde se está obteniendo el mayor porcentaje del petróleo se deriven parte de esos recursos económicos para realizar este tipo de obras que sí nos permitan una economía permanente. No como el caso del petróleo, que con el tiempo va a desaparecer y no queremos que se queden pueblos fantasmas.
Unfortunately, it's not just a question of spreading the money around. One of the biggest problems at the moment is the effect which the oil rush is having on the environment. And in most cases, that means the local farmers and the crops they grow. This is a banana plantation just south of the major oil fields and gas separation plant at Samaria. The crop is a disaster. Farmers have lost heavily, and they blame it all on the oil industry. What's happened, they say, is that the oil company redirected massive amounts of water for its plants and drilling operations. After use, polluted water went back into the local river, which periodically floods its banks, spreading petroleum and petroleum byproducts over the plantations. The last flood struck in November, wiping out an entire crop of bananas, which takes 6 months to grow. The new crop has diseased and deformed fruit, and there's only a fraction of the normal quantity. There's more pollution, say the farmers, from the air. When the nearby plant discharges its tanks, it sends up a huge poison cloud, which joins the ever-present airborne pollution that comes from the burning of excess gas. When it rains, this pollution is washed onto the plants, causing further blight and disease. There's a commission jointly manned by the the state government, the oil company and the farmers, which is charged with investigating complaints and paying out compensation. But the farmers we spoke to claimed it was very difficult to get compensation. Last time they succeeded, it took 5 years, and even then, they got only about 1/10 of their claimed losses. After the latest flood they had, the commission refused even to consider it.
Ahí podemos ir ahí a ver las peras que están haciendo, para que vean. Ah, está eso, si aquí está la pera, ¿y cuánto daño tiene este de parte del contratista de la pera que está haciendo, no?
Farmers say the oil industry is closing in on them. These plantations sit right on top of the oil and gas deposits. Right next door, a 2-hectare site has been cleared and leveled in readiness for a new oil well. The company paid 50,000 pesos for land, but the farmers say it's worth 8 times as much. And they've been given nothing to offset the extra pollution that will be added to what's already coming from the nearby gas complex. They claim there isn't a single farm in the whole region that hasn't been affected to some extent. And this situation is spread right across the south.
Y la planta de Samaria es allá, ¿no?
¿Dónde es? Samaria.
De Samaria.
Sí, ese es Samaria.
Samaria, esos son los pozos de Samaria.
Campo de Samaria.
These men earn only 70 to 80 pesos a day, so they're doubly resentful of the oil workers who can earn 10 times that amount doing a job that destroys their land in the process. It's certainly not a problem the government can ignore, as Mexico's economy is still heavily dependent on agriculture. But behind it all is the pressure of Mexico's soaring population, rising by over 2 million a year. During his 6-year term, Mexico's current president will see his nation grow by 14 million, more than the entire population of Venezuela. In economic terms, it's a race against time. How reckless can Mexico afford to be? In the oil industry itself, there are no doubts about the need to press ahead. And Pemex spokesman Cesar Baptista doesn't believe that the side effects of development have all been negative.
We've encountered a lot.
Well, we're doing our very, very best to make these payments as agile as possible. And one example, building the gas line we're building from the south to the northern system, we've been able to have almost non-complaints. And at the same time, people who have had problems do complain, but people who have been improved by new roads, by jobs which didn't exist, they don't talk, they don't make noise. So in these sort of things, you don't only get half the story only, but you get less than half the story. But the other part, you don't get it. The only way to get it is to have been there 20 years before, 10 years before, and compare. And the comparison is definitely positive.
You yourself were there 20 years ago. You
I
have
went
experienced
there
what it was like.
1952. And Villahermosa, which today is a nice, livable city, used to be a little quiet, settled town. A nice settled town is beautiful, but we think that a 500,000 population, booming city is better for more people. Perfection is not there, but perfection doesn't exist.
Let's talk about the future.
There's certainly room for optimism over Mexico's future. If there is an energy crisis ahead, Mexico will be well insulated from it. But in the shorter term, there are many problems, and they are not confined to sharing out the wealth and reducing the impact on the environment. Mexico's had to borrow heavily, for example, to meet the enormous costs of development, and the import bill is soaring. For the moment, Mexico's well justified in putting its faith in oil, but there's no guaranteed prosperity ahead. Just a much-needed breathing space in which the problems can be assessed and some solutions worked out. For that at least, Mexico has good cause to be grateful.